Hi, and welcome to day 4 of our video series Learn Toddle in 7 days. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We are going to dive into and really get to know how you use logic in Toddle application. We're going to dive into formulas, we're going to dive into workflows, we're going to learn how all that works. We've touched a little bit on that in previous videos, but we're gonna stretch it a bit today. So we're going to build a blackjack game in Toddle. If you've never built apps before, if this is your first entry into Toddle, this might be a little bit difficult, but you can always come back and watch parts of the video and sort of try and understand how every bit works. And we're going to make sure we go through everything and explain every step we do, right? But just a fair warning, this is not going to be the easiest app you can go and build. This is going to sort of showcase some of the things you can really do. So we're taking it to the next level today, right? I hope you're ready. So we are going to use an API called Deck of Cards API. And it's an open, free to use API that basically lets you create a deck of cards and shuffle it. Here's the first API route you can call. And then as long as we're using the ID of this deck we get back, we can then start drawing cards, and this API maintains the logic intact for the deck. So like if I draw 2 cards and then draw 2 cards more, I'm not going to get the same card twice because I'm drawing from the same deck and eventually run out of cards, etc. So this actually handles a lot of the logic that we would normally do for us. There isn't really a reason, since this is going to be a single player app or game, there's no real reason why we need a server involved. Like we could do all of this just in the browser and just in Toddle. But since this is handling all that logic for us, that's sort of a nice, let's just skip it and do it free. And it also comes with like images of the different cards. So we get a lot for free by using this API. And the second thing is, if we wanted to later expand this to be actually multiplayer, so multiple people could play Blackjack at the same time, like we need that logic on the server anyway. So it actually makes a ton of sense to just use this API, right? So the way it works is that you can kind of shuffle the cards here. Like this API only handles like a deck of cards. It doesn't know we're playing Blackjack. So we can't like go and say deal Blackjack, whatever, have I won? All of that logic we'll have to do ourselves. But you can, like here we can see shuffle a card, shuffle a deck, and this sort of returns this ID. And then every time we can like draw a card and we're going to give it this deck ID as part of the URL we sent to it. And that's sort of going to make sure that we're getting that it behaves the way a deck of cards should, right? And we can sort of look at the data we're getting back here. This is in JSON format, and Toddle will of course pass that for us when we call the API. But we can see we also get like these images and everything. So there's a lot of really nice things coming along with this. So Blackjack, how do we do that? I've done a little sort of Excalibur drawing here to sort of explain how we're going to think of this problem of building a Blackjack game. This is also often called modeling. It's the basic idea of saying, well, a game of Blackjack is something happening in the real world. How do we represent that game? How do we think about that game from the real world in the computer? We sort of have to we create a model of it in our application that lets us do this. And what I'm basically saying here is like, we need to figure out how do we represent like our game in terms of variables, formulas, workflows, etc. All these things that we can do. How do we all put them together to actually make a Blackjack game? So we're going to start to think about it in a little bit more abstract and say, well, actually, when we're playing Blackjack, we've got some different game phases, right? So the first phase is sort of the initially, when you start the game, and what we want to do here is shuffle the cards, right? So once we've shuffled the card, the next phase is going to be to deal cards from that shuffled deck, right? And in this case, we want to deal 2 cards to each player, right? And right now, there's just going to be 2, a player and a dealer. But each of them starts out with 2 cards. Then it's going to be first the player's turn. And the player basically have 2 options. They can hit and get another card, or they can stay. Now, if they stay, it goes on to be the dealer's turn. If they choose to hit, it's basically there's two options. Either they're busts, so that means they're over 21, which is the limit of how much you can have the maximum score on blackjack. And if they're over 21, then they're bust, and immediately it's game over, right? And then the dealer won. If they're below 21, then they have the option of either choosing, they're back here to the player's turn, right? They can then hit again, or they can choose to stay. And then it's the same logic again. So eventually they'll either stay or go bust, right? And let's assume they stay, they go to dealer's turn, and the dealer has exactly the same opportunity here. They can either hit, and then either bust or don't go bust, right? And if they don't go bust, it's back to their own turn. And if they stay, it's game over, right? And then when it's game over, we basically need to calculate who was the winner. Obviously, we kind of know if someone busted, but we can also just look at what is the score, right? What is the highest score that's still below 21, or is 21 or below, right? So we kind of need to go through this game phase. And finally, of course, when it's stale, we can maybe have an action of saying deal again. And then we actually go straight back. We're not going to necessarily shuffle the cards. We're just going to deal again. There's a ton of things in blackjack we're not going to handle in this scenario because we don't really care about multiple players. We're also going to skip some corners here and there. And we can always come back later and add functionality and fix some of the issues we have, right? Right now, it's just about getting the basic game going so you can try and play blackjack with your computer, right? Right, so let's get to it. I'm going to create a new project in Toddle. I'm going to start from a blank template, and we're going to call it Blackjack. Right, do I have a good emoji? We're going to go with guy with sunglasses. Let's see if it's like the right call, right? Okay, so the first thing we want to do here is phase 1, right? That's our init phase. And actually, the first thing we want to do is we want to keep track of what phase we're in, because it would say every phase has a different action leading to the next one and has a different set of logic attached to it. So depending on what phase we're in, the application needs to behave quite differently. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to use a variable to basically indicate what is the current game phase. And variables, as we've touched on a little bit before, allows you to store information temporarily. And temporarily means here until the user closes their browser or leaves the tab, or in case of a component, leaves the component, right? So that kind of works perfect in this case. If we're leaving the app and refreshing, etc., we're going to start over. So we're going to use a variable called game phase. And we're going to start that out saying init, I think, right? So init just means, or initial. Init, I think we called it that, didn't we? Init. Perfect. Short for initial phase, right? So our game phase starts out at initial. That's fine. Now, what we want to do here, if we go back, we want to shuffle the cards. So we've got our deck of cards API. I'm going to copy that. And then I'm going to create a new API called shuffle. And I'm just going to paste in this right here. And it passes the API as it should, right? Or the URLs it should. And it says deck count equal 1. Like we're not going to work with more than one card. I think technically in Blackjack, they usually work with like 10 or 15. So we could absolutely put this up, right? But for now, we're just gonna keep it 1. We're not so worried about people counting cards in our little for fun Blackjack game here, right? Now, what we get back here is this deck ID. And that's the important bit, because we need to pass that along for future calls to this API. So I actually want to sort of, I can access that anywhere I want. So like if I want here to get that out, I can say, not game phase, I can say shuffle, data, deck ID, right? It's easy enough to fetch, but actually since we're going to do that a lot of times, I'm just going to create a formula called deck. And I can cache the value. It doesn't really matter too much. There we go. Shuffle and data and deck ID. And what that means is that I can now, instead of doing like, let's say in here, instead of doing this thing every time, I can just do deck and grab that out directly. So it's just like a little shorthand. I made that easier to access for future formulas, right? Um, so as soon as we've done this, like I've set this to autofetch, and if you remember autofetch, it basically says as soon as you load, go and fetch this API. And also, if anything changes that basically in the specification, if anything's dynamic, it's not in this case, so it won't. But if anything changes, go and do it again, right? So in this case, I'm putting an autofetch because the second we load, we start in the init phase and we shuffle. So that actually makes a lot of sense, right? That seems to work. That immediately puts me to the next phase. As soon as I've made this API request, I want to get on to the next phase, which is the dealer phase, right? Or the deal, what do we call that? Deal cards phase, right? So in the deal cards, what we're going to do here is we're going to go and say on success. So when we've shuffled the card, when that request comes back, because we have to wait for the data to come back here when we make the request, right? When it comes back, I want to update my game phase to set game phase to deal cards. And I actually want to do one more thing. I want to then deal 2 cards to each players. So in order to deal 2 cards from our deck, we first have to draw 2 cards. We can see draw card here, and you can sort of, with this draw API, you can sort of say you can add counts. Let's copy this one. And I'm going to go back to my APIs, and I'm going to say, we're going to call this deal. And I'm going to pass that in here. And here, I need to pass in, instead of this weird deck ID placeholder we have, I'm going to pass in my deck. And that's kind of why I put it in, because it makes it very easy to use it. And I'm going to use it for other things as well, right? So here I've got my result coming back. We can sort of see what happens when you draw cards. Well, we get a list of cards back, the number we've asked here and count, right? And the first, each card has like a code. It's got a value, a suit, and then an image that actually allows to display it as an image, which is really handy. Now, since I'm dealing, I'm actually, instead of going to say draw 2 cards for the dealer and then 2 cards for player, I'm just going to say go and draw 4 cards, because I only need to make 1 request then. That's actually kind of easier, right? Just get me 4 cards, and then here in toddle I can distribute them on the different hands. Now, in this case, I don't actually want autofetch on, because I only want to make this request once we're done shuffling. So I want to trigger this with an action inside a workflow, and only then. So I'm gonna turn off the autofetch, and instead I'm gonna go into my shuffle API. So after we shuffle, we're gonna go back to this success event, and we're setting the game phase. But then the next thing I want to do is I want to call the deal API. And we're gonna call shuffle, saying, okay, now we're getting into the deal phase, and in the deal phase, then we're gonna call the deal API, right? So we're just going to say deal there. Right. Perfect. Now that we've done the deal, and we can sort of try, let's go and do refresh on this one. And what we should see happen is that shuffle gets a result back with an ID, and deal should also get a result back, because as soon as the shuffle was done, it triggered that workflow and it set the game phase. Let's just double check the game phase. It says deal cards, and then our deal API has these, should have 4 cards, right? Right, so that's all working. We're loading the game, shuffling, then we're updating the game phase to the deal phase, and then calling the deal, getting out to our 4 cards. But right now we've just got this API with our list of 4 cards. So we kind of need to represent that we need to give 2 of them to our player and 2 of them to our dealer. So in order to do that, we're going to add 2 more variables, one that represents the player's hand and one for the dealer's hands. So let's go and do that. We're going to create a variable here. We're going to call it player's hand. And I'm going to create this with a formula because I want this to be an array. So arrays are one of the two data structures in toddle. We've already talked about them a little bit in previous videos, but here you can also create an empty array inside the formula editor, right? Just by typing array and picking the data structure array here, right? Now, right now we're giving the variable the initial value, so I'm going to leave that as an empty array because when the game loads, like the variables gets initialized, we call it, they get loaded the same time the app loads, and at that point these requests, the shuffle and deal, won't have happened yet. So at that point the player doesn't have any cards, they have an empty card, or in this an empty hand, and therefore in this case we do an empty array, right? I'm gonna then go and create the same for the dealer's hand, and that's also gonna be an empty array, right? So now that I've got these two variables representing my dealer's hand, my player's hand, I can then actually divide these two, like deal these cards out. So I'm going to go into my deal API, and here I've already got the cards. And what I'm going to do is that after I run the deal, after the deal request happens, where it fetches those 4 cards, I'm going to say, well, when that's successful, I would like you to first set the player's hand. So when we're saying set variable, essentially we're completely overriding it. We're setting a whole new value, right? So it is going to be our deal, and then data, and then cards. But we don't want to give it all 4 cards, right? The player's hand should only be the first 2. And right now we're kind of giving it all of the cards, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use a new formula called take. And what that does is we can say take items from the start of an array or string. So let's put that in. And right now it's set by default to 1. We can change that to 2. And then it's going to take the first 2 items in the array. It basically creates a new array over here, which contains only the first 2 items of the deal array, right? Then we can say set dealer's hand. And I'm going to do the same here. I'm going to say the deal, data, cards. And then there's 2 options I can go here. I can either say take last, which is take the last 2, or I can say drop, which is drop the first 2 cards. Oh, let's just make sure that's a number. Drop the first 2. And then the 2 remaining. And in this case, it does the same, but it's kind of 2 ways to get to different parts of an array. You can either say, I want to specifically not have the first 2, or I want to specifically have the last 2. Now, when there's 4 items, that's the same. If there are more items, sometimes it's easier to sort of take the last n number of cards. Sometimes it's easier to drop. In this case, doesn't matter, so we'll use drop. And so what happens here is that we are now updating the player's hand, updating the dealer's hand, so they both will have like 2 cards each. And the next step we want to do, if we go back to our blackjack overview, we've dealt 2 cards to each player. Next step, player's turn, right? So we need to update our game state, our game phase, right? So right here we're going to say set game phase, and what do we call it? We call it player's turn, right? Player's turn. Good. So that already got us all the way to phase 3, right? Obviously we've only seen the data yet. So now that it's player's turn, we need to take a look at the UI and actually render out our game state, as you say, like all the cards, so we can see them, right? So let's do that. I am gonna delete these 2. We're gonna keep the UI very simple. As you're doing this and building and following, I'm kind of hoping when you get here that you'll do your own take on the UI, layout, all these things. I really love to see all the projects people are building and the variations they do on these. So I hope you'll go nuts and add a ton of a nice layout. I'm gonna keep it really simple today, right? So I want to add here I'm gonna add a div. Always good to add a div, get things wrapped in a container, right? And then I'm gonna add a list. And so in this case, we'll just delete the first two. And I think this, maybe we'll add a heading 2 inside this called the, I think the one sitting up is going to be our dealer, right? Like that. Good. One more thing is I don't really want this one to be here. I actually think I want this one to be, yeah, I think, yeah, that's fine. We'll add, yeah, cool. We'll put it right in the middle top, right? We're just going to give it some gap. So there's a little bit of space. Maybe 16 was better, right? Now, so now we've got dealer up here and the list of cards. And just like we've done in previous videos, when we have an array, which is what is in our player, or sorry, in this case, dealer hand, we want to repeat this item for every item in the array, right? I'm going to right click, I'm going to say repeat, and then in here in my formula editor, I'm just going to pick the variable dealer's hand because that is an array. Right now it's empty. Let's figure out why that is. That is because I added the formula after we called the, we did the workflow for setting these things. We defined that after the API was already called. So toddle hasn't actually called that yet. The easiest way to fix that is just to refresh, because then it's going to run the whole thing again. And now when it's fetching the or running the deal API, it's going to go and run that workflow we defined in here on success and setting all these things. So let's go have a look. Player's hand, we've got those two right here. And now we see the two list items, right? So as that's sometimes easy mistake to make. I just did. As you're defining these workflows, sometimes you realize like what order does that actually get triggered in? And if I defined a workflow after the trigger that's supposed to handle it already fired, sometimes you do need to do a quick refresh to actually get the whole thing working, right? So now we've got two of these. We are just going to do some layout. I'm going to choose my UL, my unordered list here. And I'm going to change that to be a horizontal layout. Put them in the middle. We'll put a gap as just 8. Yeah, we'll put it below. We don't really need the text inside. We're not going to represent anything with text. But what we are going to do is we're going to add an image. Because as we saw in the API, we actually get like URLs for images back that we can use for this, right? So now we've got the two images. We're going to go and select that, and then we want to set the source attribute, the src attribute on each image to actually match the URL we're getting back. And since we're repeating, if you remember, we get access to this repeat item. So the current item we're repeating over, right? I'm going to pick that one, and we've got some data. I'm just going to pick the one that says image, right? And now you can see we get the images right here. Now, if you are a little bit familiar with Blackjack, you know that this is actually already a bit wrong because we don't really want to do that yet. We don't want to show the dealer's cards. We want to wait and do that until later phases, right? But we still want to show something. So the deck of cards API here actually comes at the bottom. If we scroll all the way down with a back of card image, which is really useful. So I'm going to copy that. And for now, I'm just going to go and place that in here. I copied again. That's not great. Ooh, there we go. Back again. We copy this one, and then we're just going to paste that in here. Now, that's not really right either, because later we do need to show this, but we'll deal with that when we get there. Right? For now, we've just drawn our two cards, and they're listed here for the dealer, right? Now we need to do the same thing for the player, and the easiest way to do that is really just hold down Alt or Option, and then drag this onto the up one time, right? So I'm just dragging this over, and then I've got another two cards here. And I'm just going to move this, I think, down below. And we're going to change this to player. Right. Now, in this case, of course, I do want to show the values because there's never a reason to hide the player values. So I'm going to go and change this back to be the item image, right? Right. One more thing that might be worth doing is just doing a little bit of UI. I'm going to take this outer div, and I'm going to double click here on our layout bit. And what that does is it changes to be spaced out evenly, or what we sometimes call auto gap. And it basically says, I want you to space all the items in this, all the children of this element out evenly inside the container. And if there's only two, that just means move them to the either side. On this case, either side. So with different screen sizes, this kind of seems to make sense, at least to me, right? Good. So now we are, we've got our game set up. We've dealt. We've set this up. Let's just quickly check. And we set the phase to player's turn, right? So we kind of set up. So what we need now is essentially we need for the player to be able to do some actions, right? Like they need to be able to either hit or stay. So I'm going to add some buttons for making that happen. And I think I'm going to add them just down here next to the H2. So what I'm actually going to do is right click this one and say wrap an element, div. And then inside here, I'm going to add another button, another div. And I'll explain why. That's because I want this again to use the same spread. So we're going to lay them out horizontally. And again, I'm going to double click here to space them out evenly, right? So that means this div is now going to be out here. If I just added two buttons and spaced evenly, the one button would be in the middle and the other one all the way out here. And I want the buttons to be all to the right, right? I'm going to create this one. I'm going to drag it up, or dragging again to duplicate, changing the layout here again to horizontal and adding an 8-pixel gap, right? So now I've got this player and I've got these two buttons out to the right. That's exactly what I want. This one, the low one, is going to be hit. Nope. That was not quite right. It's going to be hit. And this one right here is going to be stay. And I'm just going to go and add the styling of this button because this shouldn't quite be the same. So we're going to change the background color to like gray 700. And then we'll do the hover style here to be gray 600, right? When I'm normally just looking at it, it'll be the sort of dark shade of gray, and we'll still add a little bit of hover effect. We always want something like a hover effect on anything we can interact with to show that it's interactable, right? Right. So now if we choose stay, that's actually the simplest event to do right now, right? Because that's all we need to do there, saying, well, okay, then it's the dealer's turn, right? If I'm staying, then we move on to the dealer. So let's go and do that. Say we add a click event here on the button. And when I click, I'm going to say set game face. And I'm going to say dealer's turn. There we go. Now hit is a little bit more difficult because here we need to draw another card and add it to the player's hand, right? So we're going to add a new API. And when I say new API, it's actually exactly the same one. It's the draw again, right? But I want it to be different because this time I'm only drawing one card. And I don't want an automatically deal action associated with it, right? So I'm just going to create it as a new API, even though we're calling the same essentially URL, the same endpoint on the server. That doesn't really matter, right? We'll just call draw. We can still create it as a separate API, which actually helps us a lot here, right? So I'm pasting that in, and I'm changing the count here in the query to 1 because I only want, let's just see. Oh yeah, and we need to change the deck, of course. Sort of paying off that we are having this deck variable that's easy to set, right? So here in the draw, I'm only drawing one card, 0, right? Here we are. And I don't actually want any action afterwards because I'm going to be using this same API for the dealer later on. And they're going to have different actions associated with it. So I'm not going to define anything here in this workflow right here. There's a different way I can deal with that. Of course, we also need to remember to check off auto fetch because we only want this draw action to happen when I click it, right? I want to control exactly when this request done. Toddle shouldn't be trying to do anything smart about figuring out, oh, I'll just automatically fetch it. We don't want any of that, right? So I'll just close this. So when I click the button hit, right, I want to draw a card, and then I want to add that card to the player's hand. So I'm going to do my click event here. And then here I've got my draw API. I'm going to call that. And you can see when we call the APIs as an action from a workflow here, we get those little events here, these little workflow events here. And these are technically separate, like it's its own workflow, but they're assigned to the same event, which is the API comes back. The difference is that when I define it on an API level, right, when I define it in here, every time that API gets called, no matter how it gets called, every time it gets called, it will execute that exact workflow, right? Or that success or error workflow, like every single time. It doesn't matter if it's being from an auto fetch or whenever I call it from action. Those actions that are in that workflow will always get called. Now on the button click here, right? If I'm inside this workflow and say on success, it is only in this workflow that these actions will happen. So this means that because I can use the same API call for drawing for the player and drawing for the dealer, but obviously what happens after we draw the card is different. We have to add it to a different hand, right? So I'm going to go on success here, and I'm going to say set player hand. And as you remember, whenever we do set a variable, we are completely replacing the current value in it with the one we're providing, right? So we need to start by saying, I want my player's hand. Now that was great when we did deal because there was an empty array and it's fine to just get rid of it, right? But in this case, we don't want to get rid of any of the existing cards from the deal phase, right? So I'm going to take the current hand and then I'm going to say concatenate. Concatenate lets you add together multiple strings or arrays into one bigger either string or array. It works both on strings and arrays. In this case, we're using it for arrays, right? And then I'm going to add the second one, and this is going to be my draw data. We haven't done that yet because we haven't actually triggered the event. So let's just go and do that. I'm going to press there, hit. And just by doing that, now we've got data, right? Now I can go into my button here, click, and on success. And in here, now we have the data. So all I did, the whole reason why I shut this down, went out, clicked, is just because I want to be able to see the data I'm working with. And since we hadn't made that draw request yet, because it's when you click the button, it's actually easy to go trigger the event, make sure toddle fetches that data, and then come back here and actually see the data you're working with, right? So I'm here, I'm getting all my yes, I also did somewhat ironically add half of the concatenate function. So you can see it's gotten really weird here because I tried to add some data from the API, which is obviously not great. But this formula should work because it adds the cards now, right? So we're adding like some cards, but then also have, unfortunately, this. We can just fix that. The only reason why this happened was because I actually set a bad formula and then when it did the click. So I'm just going to refresh and this will sort itself out. So now we've got the cards loaded and let's just try play and say hit. And we see that nothing happens. And actually I know why nothing has happened. I just actually realized that. Because what we're doing here is that when we're rendering these two items, we didn't change this repeat formula. So right now this one up here says repeat for dealer's hand, and this one down here actually says the same. So we're going to go and change that to player's hand. And now we see that this one down here shows the 3 cards because our hit works. Let's just give it one more try. Hit, and we get another card, right? Okay, so now we've got, let's just do a quick check here. We've got our initial phase, we're shuffling cards, we can do player's turn, where you can do hit, and return to player's turn and stay and move on. But what we're missing now is this bust here, right? We need to figure out if the player, after a hit, if the player's bust, that means their total value is over 21, then they immediately lose the game. And therefore, we need to go straight to game over, right? So how do we do that? Well, the first question is, how do we know what their total score is? Like, I can look at this and saying, well, there's a 10, that's 10. I know the queen is another 10, and then 2, 5, or 2 and 3. So I know the total is 25, right? But the computer doesn't know that, right? It's just looking at images. So we've got a lot of data. We haven't done any way of calculating, like, what is the total score. So let's go and do that. I'm going to create a formula that calculates a total hand score. So let's go and create that, and we're going to call that hand score. All right. And so I could actually create two. I create one that's called player hand and one that's called dealer hand score, but I'd rather just add an input of hand. And then here I can go and I'll just, for demo purpose or for development purpose, copy the player's hand at this point. Right, we're copying that one. We can just click that little copy icon here and then paste that in here into the test value. And just like with test values in attributes, variables, well, attributes specifically, that just means that while we're developing this formula, we get like some data we can work with, right? When I'm actually going to use this formula, I'm going to pass in as that input, hand input, I'm going to pass in either the player hand or the dealer hands, because I know I'm going to use it for both, right? I need to calculate first the player's hands and then the dealer's hand, and then at some point I also probably need to compare them if they both end up staying, right? I need to figure out who's the winner. So having a formula that basically says I'm going to calculate the total score is going to be very useful. Now, the way we're going to do that is for each item in the hand here, we've got this value, right? And the value is basically, as it says, what is the value of the card. It doesn't care about the suit, it just cares about the value. Now, what we'll notice is that if we take this first element, that's going to be the queen up here, the value is going to be queen. So in terms of getting that to a numeric value, we actually first need to go and sort of map all those picture cards, we say, to numeric values, which is basically all this: Jack, Queen, King, and Ace. And Jack, Queen, and King should be 10 in Blackjack. That's the rule. Ace is technically either 11 or 1, but I think for now we're just going to put it in as 11, and then we can consider coming back later and fixing it so it also works with 1, right? But in order to do that, I'm actually going to create another function, or sorry, another formula that just gives me the card value, right? Or card score. No, we'll call it card value. So I'm going to go create a new one, and it's going to be called card value. And it's also going to take an input, and I'm just going to put in the input string. So in this case, we'll say king. Value name, and then we'll put in king as a test value, right? Because it can be either Jack, King, Queen, Ace, or any of the numbers. But if you notice, actually, if we go into player hand here, even the value is still a text. Like, it's still set as text. So even if it is a 10, we still have to convert it to an actual number before we can start adding it up. Because text here, you can't add them up. It only works with numbers. Right. So we were doing hand score. That's not actually, we're doing the card value formula. Let's get back to that. I'm just going to go full screen on this one, right? So what we basically need to do here is saying there's all these specific cases, Jack, Queen, King, where it needs to return 10, and then Ace, where it needs to return 11. And what we could do is we could go in and basically say if, and this if formula then basically says the first item here is the condition. So if value equals king, so this is going to be true if the value we get in is equal to king, then 10 else, and then we could keep going if, and then, you know, here, copy that, value equals queen. 10, and we could keep, or we could do if value else. There's a lot of ways we could build up that logic. There's a lot of ways we could get there, but I actually think the easiest way is to create what we call a lookup map. And a lookup map is just an object, but it's got a lot of these keys on it and values. And what we're basically doing, we're saying here all the, so let's actually go and say, we'll start with Jack for good measure, Queen, King, and Ace. And for Ace, it should actually be 11, right? So we created an object that has Jack, King, Queen, and Ace, and then the actual value it should be. And in this case, we can see I also put it in a string because that's the default. It doesn't matter because we know that we need to convert it to a number anyway, so might as well do it later. And now that I have this object, what I want to do is I want to use the get formula. What this does is if you give it in the first, as here's the object, the first input, you give it an object, or it can be an array. And then second, for the path, you basically tell it what is the name of the key that I want to access. Get me the value at that key. And the reason why it's called path is that you can actually, if you have nested objects, you can actually give it an array and it'll like keep going down into the object. I'll show that another time. But for now, we're just going to put value in here, king. And what this does is saying, well, here's an object. Get me the king key. And that's this one here. And then it's going to return the value 10 and see that we get that out here. Now this is going to work now for Jack, King, Queen, and Ace. But it won't work for any of the numeric values because they're not in this object. And I don't actually want to add them all because that's unnecessary. I can just say, well, if it's not in here, it's going to be null. And if it's null, then I can use default2. And what default2 does is saying if the value is not null, just return the value. But if it is null, if this is going to be null, so let's say if I'm here saying Andreas, right? That's not a value. That's not in this object, so it's going to be null, and then it's going to default to this value right here, which we're just going to say is value, right? And so in this case, let's just put this back. In this case, what it's going to do is saying, if the value you give it is one of the ones listed in object, return the matching value. Otherwise, it's going to say the default value, which is going to be like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then it's going to end up here with a string. So the last thing is just we're going to convert this to a number. So this is a little bit more of a complex formula, right? We took an object, we accessed that value, we defaulted to the default value here if it's not one of these that needs mapping, and then finally converted to a number. And what we end up with is that no matter what card we give it, it's going to return us the actual value it's worth in Blackjack, right? Let's go and do that. So now that we have that formula, we can go and create the hand score formula because we needed that in order to get the score for each card. So we've got 4 cards here. The first thing we're going to do, because right now this array in the hand score formula is an array of all the cards, right? So what we want to do is twofold. First, we're going to take this array of cards and turn it into an array of numbers, each representing the hand score. And then finally, we're going to sum all them up into a total, right? So I'm going to take my hand and then I can use a formula called map. This is not actually related to what I just said, a lookup map with objects before. A lookup map is just kind of a concept. It's not an actual formula, anything in toddle. It's just an object, right? Map here, what that does is it takes an array and then you give it a formula here. And it basically transforms every item in that array using that formula. So in this case, I've got my hand and then the default is just item, right? Which basically means that the output is going to be exactly the same as the input. So we get exactly the same array out. But if I go and say value, for example, here, we're now getting a list of all those values. So pick just the value out from each of those items in the array. And now if I finally go and say, what was it called? Card score, card value. Oh, let me just add that in again. Item, value. We're actually going to get those numeric values out. So we say the 10 and the queen are going to be 10 and 10. That's correct. And then 2 and 3, 2 and 3. That's right. So now we've got all the actual values for each card in an array. Now what we need to do is sum it up into a single value, and I can use the sum node here to do that. And this gives us 25, which is also the correct score for these, right? So this is our hand formula, right? The hand score formula. We can pass that either the dealer's hand or the player's hand, and out it's going to spit the total score of that value. Now, I'm actually just going to go and add that on screen. I'm not sure if I want that as a hint for the player. I kind of like the idea that you have to count them up, because that feels like real blackjack. So I might remove it later, but for like a development purpose and while we're working it, it's really nice. So I'm going to add just going to add a paragraph, and inside this paragraph right here, I'm just going to change this text to be a formula. I'm going to say what we call hand score and then player hand, right? And so this always shows the player's hand. Let's just go and try and give that a refresh and try it from start, right? We start out with 8. It takes a little while to load, to be honest, the images. I'm not quite sure why. But anyway, that's probably the API. It might be faster when we're doing it live. So we've got 2 4s, and we can see that the current score at 8. So that works. And if I go and say hit, I'm getting an 8, and we end up on 16. Perfect. Right. So now that we have access to the hand score, the real question is, when I hit, right? If after we do that hit, we go bust, that means our hand score is over 21, then we need to go directly to game over, right? So let's try and do a hit again, right? So now we've got 26. Now what we wanted here is essentially go to the game over state. We're supposed to go straight from here, bust, down to game over, and then show the winner. And in this case, the winner would be the dealer, right? So let's go and do that. When we on the hit event here, when we click this, we're going to go and edit this workflow. Now we still need to draw, because first we draw the card and then we check in the bust, right? So we're going to go into this unsuccess formula. And right here, it's setting the player's hand. Now I'm still happy with that, because after setting the player's hand, like we need to update the hand before we validate if it's bust, right? But in here, I'm going to add a switch action. Now, so we've seen a few of these actions. Switch is a little bit different than other actions in a workflow. Switch kind of work like if else, but it's basically a whole lot of different scenarios, and it's going to go from left to right and say, well, here's the first one, and I can say if, and we basically get to give it a formula with a condition. And the way switch works is saying, if that condition is true, then go and do those actions we set down here, right? And this one's going to be set game face, game over, right? So the condition here is if player is bust, right? So I'm going to go and change that. And that's basically going to say get a hand score, player hand. And what was our condition for going bust? That is if this is greater than 21, right? And it is, it says right now, it is. And therefore we should go to the game over phase. Now, of course, let's just do one more thing. We'll just go and say, give this a name, player is bust. Right, because now that'll show up here, and it's a little bit easier to understand when we name these formulas, right? Now, we can add more conditions here. We don't need to in this case, but you can add more to a switch, and you can basically say, well, if the player's bust, then do that. If some other condition, do that. And it'll do one at a time, and it'll only ever pick one of them. So it'll pick from the left the first one it can go through, right? And if not, it'll go through the else branch here, right? In this case, we don't want to do anything on else. We're perfectly fine just saying, well, if the player's bust, set the game phase to game over. Otherwise, don't do anything, because we're still at the player's turn phase then, right? Good. We haven't done any condition for game over yet. so maybe we should go and add that. I'm just going to go and say, on the root element, we're going to add a new div. We are going to say it should be on styling. We're going to position it fixed. Fixed position means it's going to be outside of the normal layout of all the other elements. And we're going to position it relative to the viewport. So in this case, I'm going to say left 0 and top 0. And then I'm going to say width to be 100% and height to be 100%. And what I get is a div that sits on top of the whole screen. So I can't actually click on anything now because it sits on top of everything and blocks the whole thing. And I can sort of say, let's set a background color of, actually, let's do it like this. We'll set a background color of sort of slightly off gray here, black here, right? Slightly transparent black. And then inside this element, I'm going to add a heading 2 that says game over. Let's just do that. And on the div, on the top one, we're going to go. This is still Flexbox inside. So the div element itself have been pulled outside of the layout. So it doesn't matter that like anything is Flexbox because it just sits on top. But inside that is still normal Flexbox layout. So we can still go and say center it. Now it says game over. And then after that, we can add like winning condition. But we'll stick with just game over. Now, we only want to show this element if we're in the game over phase. So I'm going to go and right click and say show hide. And this is going to be if the game phase is equals to game over, right? And so the show hide is basically the formula here that says, should this element even be present on the screen at all, or should I remove it? And it specifically removes the element entirely from the browser. Like if the browser doesn't know about it if we hide it. It's not the same as you can also hide it here with something like layout none. There's a lot of ways you can do that. But in this case, it actually entirely removes that from the web page. And then if that formula turns true, so when we go to game over, let's just try that. It should go and say game over. So let's give that a refresh. Every time we refresh, of course, we're resetting all our variables. We're shuffling the deck again. We're dealing again. So it's a really nice way to just start over and try your app again, right? So we've got our 2 cards. We've got a player score of 12. Let me just go into test mode, and I'm going to hit once. And immediately I can see I get 22. And as a result, our game over screen comes up. So if we're just recapping what happened here, right? We immediately went to init, right? It shuffled the card on the API. It went through the deal card phase where 2 cards get allocated to each player. All this happens as we load the application, right? Then when we go to the player turn, I hit once, which gave me another card, a 10. And then our we see our logic here, because that's more than 22 in total. 22 is more than 21. We go to bust and then immediately to game over. And the way we see that in our toddle app is that on this hit button right here, on that click event, when we choose hit, we draw a card, then we set the player hand with a new card, and then we go and make this check. Player is bust. Let me just add a question mark here. No, actually, there's not a question mark. That it is bust. That's because that's correct. So we say that if the player's hand score is greater than 21, which it is, 22, then go to the game phase, right? Going directly to the game phase, game over. And on this little overlay, we have a logic formula that says you should be shown if the game phase equals game over, right? So as soon as that happened, as soon as we set that variable, our UI automatically say, hey, I'm out of date. I need to update because I'm supposed to be present when the game over is here, right? Great. So we're pretty far now, right? We've got a lot of this going. There's a few more things we need to do. If we stay at some point, we need the dealer to play the dealer's turn, of course. And the second bit is when we get to the game over phase, it would be nice if it indicated who won, right? And maybe we should start with that. Maybe let's start with who won. So I'm just going to add here because I'm already here. I'm going to move myself back to the right side. It's always a little bit. Oh, there we are. And on this overlay, which I've got here, I'm going to add a paragraph, right? And in this paragraph, I wanted to either say dealer 1 or player 1. And there's a few ways I can do this. So obviously we can set the text using a formula. We've done that a few times before, especially in previous apps, right? But I'm actually going to do it different this time. I'm going to create a text string in here, or text node, that's called player 1. And then we'll do a emoji with some celebration here. There we go. Just a space in. So that's the player 1, and we're just going to make that, we're going to make that a little bit bigger. 1 rem. It's already 1 rem, so we'll just add a little bit of size. Right, here we are. So what I'm doing here is actually I'm holding down Option or Alt, and when I'm doing that, I can increment and decrement this value with the arrow keys, and it takes like decimal points. If I just do up and down, it's going to increment full values. If I hold Shift, it's going to do an increment of 10. And for rem units, that's a bit aggressive, so that's why I'm doing, for rem, I'm doing it with Option, right? Right, so we've got player 1, and then I'm going to duplicate this by Option or Alt dragging, and I'm going to say here dealer 1. And I wonder if I have a good emoji for that. Dealer gambling. Yeah, we'll take that one. Slot machine, that's fine. Right. So now we've got both of them. So instead of trying to sort of do the logic for how to display the text, I'm just going to add 2 of them, and then I'm going to put a show hide formula on this. So the player 1, if the player hand, or actually if the hand score for the player is less than or equal to 21, it has to be, because otherwise, if the player's bust, player always loses. There's no, you don't wait for the deal to go bust. You're just dead, right? So it's either if that's it wins if it's less than, and actually it's and let's say dealer, let's say hand score dealer is less than hand score player, right? So the player's hand has to be less than 21, means it's a valid hand. It has to be more than the dealer's, or here hand score dealer is greater than 21. Right, let's just expand to see that again. Make sure we got the logic right. So the player wins if it's not bust, so less or equal to 21, right? And then either the dealer has to be bust, which is the dealer's hand score is greater than 21, or the dealer's hand has to be less than the player's hand. That looks right. So I'm going to copy this, just Command C in this case, and I'm going to just go and do the same thing on the show hide for this one. I'm just going to paste that and do not, right? I could probably have done it just as simple for the dealer one. It's just, this is just taking whatever this is and saying the opposite. So if this is true, then it'll be false. If it's false, then true. And since either the player one or the dealer one, that should work just fine, right? It's just going to be the opposite. So now we've got player one, dealer one. And the last thing I want to add to the screen, right, is a button. And that's going to say deal again. And let's just add some gap in here. Add a bit more. And deal, what that does again is it basically like redeal the hand, right? When we click that button, when we're game over, we'll click the hand and say deal again. And that is actually quite, because let's have a look here and say the deal again should take us back to deal cards, right? So we can actually skip the init. We're not going to reshuffle. We're just going to deal the cards again. And this whole phase actually happens off an API. So all we can do here, I'll show you what I mean by that. All we should need to do here, at least, if I did it right, is call deal. Because when we call the deal API, we talked about this a little bit before with these actions, this on success is always called no matter where we call from. And that's the one that sets the player's hand and sets the game phase. The dealer's hand and the game phase. So that should actually restart the game just fine. So let's go and give that a test. Deal again. And we're back to start, right? Right, good. The other bit we're missing is that we need to be able to stay as a player. And actually, we'll just do that here, right? I want to press stay. And if I remember, did we add anything to stay already? We did add this, right? And we changed the game phase to dealer's turn, right? Now, we don't have any way of seeing if it's the dealer's turn. So I think let's go and fix that first. The immediate thing we should see when it becomes the dealer's turn is we should see their cards. That's a really good indicator that's the dealer's turn, right? So we did that with the images, right? Remember, we set them all to be this hard-coded value right here. Let's just open the formula. So this one right here. So I'm going to copy that because we still want that sometimes. But we want a condition here. So we're going to say if, and then game phase equals dealer's turn, right? Then it should show the otherwise the back, right? So if it's not if it is the dealer's turn, we want to show the item.image like that. Otherwise, show the back of the cards. Now we actually also want to show them if it's game over. So I'm gonna add an or, and this is gonna say game phase equals dealers game over, right? So if the game phase is the dealer's turn or game over, show these cards. Otherwise, show the back, right? Let's check. Let's just go and refresh, start over, and see if it changes correctly as it should, right? So we're loading some cards. API is being a little bit slow at the moment. Hopefully it'll be better once we run this live. But yeah, okay, and we go to 20, so that's perfect. I'm gonna say play, I'm gonna say stay, and then immediately the dealer's hand turns over, right? Great. So now we're in the dealer turn. So the only thing left in our game now is that we need the dealer to be able to play its own hand. And when it's done doing that, we need to then evaluate who's the winner, right? Good. So the first thing I'm going to do, and again, this is mainly just to help me, I'm going to put the same little, I'm going to copy this little paragraph into here. But in this case, I'm going to change the text to be dealer's hand, right? Or change the input to be the text to be the dealer hand score, right? Right. Okay, so currently it's at 10. Now, this gets a little bit more tricky, right? Because we're not making the calls with like hit and stay. We need that to be automatic, right? We need the dealer to figure out how to play its own hand. And that actually is like that might not seem like the most trivial thing, and it isn't, but we'll get through it, right? So in order to do this, we are going to need to evaluate like the current score 10, right? Then we're going to say, and actually there's a simple set of rules that most dealers play by, which is basically they stop at 16 and hit before that. So, and I believe that's kind of a set rule in Blackjack, but I'm not 100% sure. But I believe that's like how all dealers should play. So they should basically play by an algorithm, which makes it very easy to essentially make a computer version, right? So we're going to create a workflow that does that. It's going to say, is my score less or equal to 16? Then I'm going to hit. If it's more than 16, no, if it's 16 or over, I'm going to stay. If it's less, then I'm going to hit, right? So let's go and do that. And in order to do that, we're going to create a workflow. So workflows we create here, and we're going to call it dealer AI. Now, is this an AI? No, not really, but we're going to call it dealer AI. Right? It's not, maybe not, at least in the most modern sense, right? So I created this workflow called dealer AI. And the idea is that every time we run that workflow, it's going to do this evaluation of the step. Now, workflow is created this way. You might notice that this is a little bit different than, like, it essentially works the same way as when we create a workflow, let's say on the event of API success or click or anything like that. But it's kind of its own thing, and it doesn't get called, like this doesn't run unless you call it with an action. And this is what we're going to do when we go into dealer start. And I'll show you how that works. Actually, let's just do that right. The second I click stay here, actually, I'm going to, on this event, immediately say, right, we're going to change the game phase. And then I'm going to say dealer AI. I'm going to call the dealer on the dealer to evaluate its position, right? Like, go and do your thing. Run the dealer AI, right? So let's go and define what that workflow should be. So the first thing we want the dealer to do, or actually the only thing really, this is just one step. We want it to evaluate its own score. If it's 16 or above, it should stay. If it's less than 16, it should hit, right? Yeah. So let's go and do that. We're going to say a switch because we're doing an if else. Like anytime we're doing this, like either do this or do that in a workflow, that's a switch. And then we're going to define the first formula here, which is going to be if, and we're going to get our hand value, hand score, right, for the dealer hand. So you can see how creating this formula to do this little bit of logic saved us a ton of work, because otherwise we would have to go and do these calculations every single time. It would have been a nightmare. So by just being a little bit smart about what kind of formulas you create, especially these that takes input and are quite flexible, you can really make your life a lot easier, right? So I'm looking at my hand score here, and what we care about here is this greater than or equal to 16, right? That's our score. 16 or above, we're going to call it, right? And if it is, oh, I'm going to keep this open. It was open. There we go. 16 above. If it is, then we're going to say, oh, then the game phase is actually a game over, right? Because then we're staying. We don't really need to, like, we don't have like an action of stay, because all we need to do is the game, just move it on to game over, right? So we set the game phase to game over, right? Now, this actually both works if the what's it called, dealer is bust, and if it's making a decision. It actually doesn't matter in this case. And I'll show you what I mean in a second, right? And so the alternative to being 16 above is, of course, being below. And if it's below 16, what do we want it to do? Let's have a look here. Well, then it should, hit, right? So it's going to draw another card and then evaluate again. So let's go and do that. We're going to draw a card. When we've done that, because we're calling, the reason why we have these on success, right, and we're doing this bit is because we have to go and make a request to a server and say, give me another card from this API. So we are not doing the next step of the workflow. We're not going to put it down here because we need to wait until that is done. Otherwise, we don't have the data yet. So I'm going to go say on success. So when we've successfully fetched that card, we're going to set the dealer's hand. And we're doing exactly the same thing we did with the player's hand here, right? After the draw, dealer's hand, we're going to concatenate. And we are going to concatenate draw data, and we don't have any data, so now we're going to go and do the whole thing again. We can actually hack this a little bit. So remember how when we did or cheat a bit, I suppose. Remember how when we did the player hand, right? We didn't actually, we just, like when we did hit, we called draw again and evaluated the player hand, right? So we're doing that right here. If I go into test mode, now our draw API actually has data. Now it's technically not the data for the dealer hand, right? But for us to build the formula, that's not a problem because it will be run before we actually get there, right? So in this case, let's go to our AI. So what I'm doing here, the reason I ran all this is because I want some data so I can build this formula, right? I need to know what this looks like. And this is exactly the response we're going to call after calling draw, even though technically the data we're looking at right now is the data from the player. But by the time this actually gets evaluated, it won't be. I hope that makes sense. So now that we've called draw, right, and updated the player's hand, what do we need to do? Well, we need to essentially evaluate the whole step again, right? So we again want to go and say, oh, now we updated dealer's hand. Is it now 16 or above? Then go to game over. Otherwise, go to the draw. And we already have a workflow that does this. So we don't need to copy this in. We can just say dealer AI, right? And so what actually happens here is that for every single time it draws a card, it goes back again to do the decision. This is what we call a recursive workflow. Recursive means something that calls itself. You can do this both for formulas and for workflows. In this case, the dealer says, I'm gonna evaluate this decision. Is it above 16 or above? If it is, go to game end. Otherwise, draw a card, and then we again evaluate. And eventually, of course, as you draw cards, it will be over 16, and we will get to the end phase. And that might happen immediately. It might happen after drawing one card. It could happen after drawing 3, 4, 5 cards, right? That doesn't really matter. Eventually, it'll get there. So with all that, we should have a working blackjack game, unless I missed something. But let's give it a shot. I think we'll go and do the full test. So I'm going to go to the preview page, right? And we're drawing cards. I'm getting 19. 19 for me is a stay. Dealer immediately draws a card. We can see got to 17 and then game over. And it says player 1. That seems correct. Let's try dealing again. We've got a dealer. Now, this is why we should probably hide this value, right? Because right now it's saying what the dealer has. That's probably not great. So we'll go and read this after, right? But I'm at 16. I'm going to feel a little bit of interest. I'm going to try hitting on 16. And I'm drawing an 8, getting to 24. Immediately dealer 1. And we never ran the workflow, right? Because we skipped, as you can see here, right? We skipped right from this bust down to the game over phase. Let's just quickly here go and remove this one and that one. And we'll just give it a quick try again. We've got our game. I'm on 17. I'm going to stay. Dealer is at 21. Dealer 1. Okay. So that is our blackjack game. Let's just go and publish it. We might as well finish off in a good manner. Right, go publish. And we'll say game finished. And we'll publish this branch, right? And now you can find it at blackjack.toddle.site. I'll also list that in the description, of course. So that was it. This was quite a long video. It was also certainly not the easiest one. We stepped up the difficulty a little bit here. Actually, I think some of the following videos are going to be a little bit simpler. But I think it's really important to get into understand what is possible in Toddle. Like, you can build incredibly complex logic. You can build like games. You can build, of course, web apps, SaaS apps, anything you want. And it's something that you can learn. It's something that you can get the hang of. That doesn't mean it's easy to do on the first try, but go through the video. If you need to go through it multiple times, that's fine. Everybody did when they were learning, right? And I really hope you're going to take this project and try and tweak it, right? There's a lot of things you can do. As you mentioned, it doesn't actually handle aces correctly now. So that might be a thing we want to address at some point. I believe there's also a rule that you can only have so and so many cards. I'm not sure. But there might be some rules we've left out. And also definitely layout, styling, messaging, all these things. There's so many things where we can take this from being a simple, card game to something a little bit more nice. And I really hope you're going to try and play around with it, because that's usually when Toddle clicks and we really start getting, okay, how do I use these tools that are in Toddle to build something really powerful? If you do that, please come on to our Discord channel and share what you've built. We really love seeing projects that people have built. So yeah, please do that. And if you haven't subscribed already to our YouTube channel, please do that. We've got more videos coming in this series. And thank you very much for watching.